Okay, everybody, welcome to the Wenlock Barn. Our next speaker is Paul Lashmar, who is going to talk to us about the Drax family and especially Sir James Drax of Hackney. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, I'm going to start off by just telling you why I think my subject is important, which is the Drax family are the only family that were at the beginning of the colonies back in 1627. They were a family that was landed in Barbados. I'll give that a bit more detail. But they still own the same plantation in Barbados that their ancestors did in 1627. So they've had it for 400 years, of which 200 years they had people who were enslaved captives from Africa. And I didn't know this when I set off on my adventures some 6 years ago. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context, about how I came to do this work, because by background, I'm an investigative journalist. You can see up here that I worked I was on staff at The Observer, The Independent, World in Action, and I've done work for various other places. For the last 20 years, I've also been academic. I've just retired from City St George's Department of Journalism, where I was head of department. I'm now an emeritus fellow, but I'm still researching Drax, because I'm a bit gripped by it. But being an investigative journalist, I have a rather obsessive nature, and 6 years is a short space of time for an obsessive person. So the basis of all this is my book, which is Drax of Drax Hall, and if you're interested, it's just also a paperback, it's also e-book, and also it's on Audible. So it's available in all those formats. Right, so this is a bit of a strange story, but most people, I live in Dorset, I live in West Dorset. The central character narrative strand of my book is a place called Charborough Park, and there is a restoration mansion here which has been owned by the Drax family since 1547. Now, not everybody's been to Dorset, but I find in these situations that the one relevance that sometimes works is that when you're driving through Dorset, because Dorset does not have a motorway, it only has a couple of main roads, the main one being the A31, and that's the road you can see there. So if you're driving through, as people do, either on holiday in Dorset, but perhaps you're going on to Devon, you've born and you're trying to make distance, you come to this double leg of what's known as the Great Wall of Dorset. It's peculiar because it goes off and seems to go on forever, about 3 miles. And it double legs, and there are these triumphal arches with stags and lions on, which if you ever beat through, you may recall. Anybody in here recall it? Think, what is that? Well, that's quite a useful point of location for those who have seen it. So this is the wall that surrounds Charborough Park, which is the central basis of Charborough Estate. And this is where a light bulb moment occurred to me, because back in June 2020, I was driving home from a university I was at the time, and I was listening to Radio 4, as journalists tend to do, and I was listening to the news, and there was a discussion about how the Colston statue had just been dumped into Bristol Harbour. And I, interesting, how to keep up the news. And as I was driving past the Raybrook, Dorset, I thought, well, isn't this the place where there's an MP who lives, and that he's very wealthy and he has had something to do with slavery? I thought, well, I live in Dorset, I don't know anything about this person. And so I thought, well, I'll have a look when I get home, as you know, because curiosity. So it's a little light bulb moment, which 6 years later, here I am. So what that was, I essentially got home and I looked it up and I thought, well, this is Richard Drax, by the way, and that's Richard Drax with his friend Jacob Rees-Mogg. Both lost their seats in June 2024. they're both having quite long parliamentary careers. And so I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. So I Googled Richard Drax, and I thought, having some kind of relationship with slavery, which I did not know what it was, that he might have said something useful, given that the whole issue about Corston was quite a big debate going on. Was quite controversial. So I thought he might have a contribution. The other thing I could find was that he wrote a weekly column in the Dorset Echo. And there was one of them that he indicated that he had noticed that this was all going on. And he said two things. He'd been really angered by the protests about Corston and about Black Lives Matter. And he said that he was appalled that someone had sprayed the letters BLM on the cenotaph. And I could see why he would be annoyed, because he's an ex-guardsman. Before he became a politician, he was firstly, he was a guards officer, he left as captain, and then he went on for 17 years as a journalist, including he was a BBC reporter in BBC South. He then got politics about 2006 and got elected in 2010 and went on to June 2024. His comment was that he was really annoyed about the vandalism of the cenotaph. And unfortunately, that wasn't actually true. It turned out the Metropolitan Police said that had not happened, but that's still up on site. He also indicated that he thought that the protest indicated a wave of intolerance that was going through the country, which was a particular view. And that was it. So I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. And one of the other things I noticed was that he had essentially been a really hardline Brexiteer. So I thought, well, that's sort of kind of interesting. And I saw that had to work it out, but essentially he was a member of the European Research Group within the Conservative Party, the ERG. That was about 60 MPs who were really very dominant in the period up to the vote. They sort of they were the tail that wagged the dog, the Conservative Party, because they were very solid and they wanted to go to Brexit. And I asked you to hold the thought that one of the comments he made at the time was that this country is overcrowded. You bear that thought. Right. So, the next thing I did was what journalists always do. At this point, I hadn't quite decided, but what I was beginning to do is that investigative journalists, their job, if they're doing it properly, is effectively to keep the rich and powerful accountable. That's what we do. We look to see where the rich and powerful may be exploited their positions to take advantage of the public at large or whatever, and we look into it. And an obvious place to start to measure some member of interest is you're looking at MPs, so I looked it up. Now, this one's dated the 7th of December. It's essentially the same as the one I'd seen. And I've looked at lots of registered members of interest over the years, because that's what you do. Look up an MP, see what register said. And the thing that struck me in this was that I immediately realised this was probably, in the circumstances, the minimal that you could put into a register. And it didn't really tell me very much, because as you see, I've outlined land and property portfolio. It says you have to declare if you've got land over £100,000 and it's giving retail income of over £10,000 a year. And then you roughly say what it is. Well, that doesn't tell you very much, really. You wouldn't, if you were interested in conflicts of interest and you wanted to know whether someone was in a position to have conflicts of interest, which is what journalists are supposed to check, you wouldn't glean much, because an awful lot of people these days have a property portfolio over £100,000. It's not unusual. Anybody who owns a house in Hackney probably has got property worth, in fact, indeed, a small flat were worth over £100,000, and you wouldn't need a lot of property to get £10,000 a year rental. So that's a very small indicator. The fact he says woodlands, farmland, residential and commercial property, well, that does indicate there's a lot of something, but what it is, he doesn't really tell you. So I thought, well, that's sort of interesting, because I would take the view, and this is something I've laid at the feet of the registrar of members' interests, of how to stand in a certain place so the camera could get me, so if I keep wandering back in. So what I thought was, well, that's pretty minimal. I know he's got a lot of something, but that doesn't tell me what, and I'd expect it to say what. And this is often the problem with trying to track this stuff down. It doesn't make it easy for anybody, a member of the public who wants to know something, quite hard to find out. The other thing I then did was I thought, well, I'll look at the companies. Now, Companies House is online, so you can look up the company and you can see what it means. So I started off with Abbott's Court Farm Company, Holdings Limited. And this is property, obviously, he is a director or has shareholdings in. I couldn't find it. So I thought, well, that's a bit odd. Then I looked at AMF Company Holdings, and I couldn't really find that either in that form. I looked at Morden, but I could find that. So I then had to go to see what directorships Richard, his full name is Richard Grosvenor Plunkett Ernley Earl Drax. He's one of the rare 4-barreled names. You have to get royal license to have that kind of name. So actually, at various points, they've had to go to the king or queen at the time and ask for that extension to add a barrel, as it were. Anyway, it turns out that Abbott's Farm, when you look at its directorship and then cross-work it was a company called ACF Company, which isn't exactly the same. I thought, and then on over to this, it wasn't such a variant, but it still wasn't the same. I thought, well, that's a bit sloppy for an MP. I mean, an MP should really be on top of these things. So I thought, at this point, I'm getting the sort of, rather than thinking, oh, well, other people have written about it, and also that it's all in order, I'm getting already at this point to think, well, this looks sloppy. Why is this sloppy? And so that was I'm starting getting the taste, thinking, I'm going to look at this further. And that's what I then started to do. So this is just telling you on the register what you're supposed to do. There is, as it will become apparent in due course, a conspicuous absence of that. And you'll notice that is December 2020, and I'll come to that in a moment. Right, that's Charborough House. It's about the same age. This is slightly older, I think, 1539. Yeah, this was the Tudor version of this was burnt down during the Civil War. It got a bit nasty in Dorset, as it got in many places, and the Royalists burnt down the parliamentarians' houses and vice versa. So that's built about 1550, 1560. And that's at the centre of the park. Now, so I start to look a bit further. So I think, well, where should I look? So the first thing I actually spotted was quite interesting, because I was at the land registry. I sort of knew that a lot of the stuff would be in trust, because if you have an estate, it's just obvious that if you own an estate, you put it in trusts. You have family trusts. That's what everybody who has a large estate does. So, but I did find online the indication that there was a rental. They rent a lot of properties, I knew that. But this one was particularly interesting. The location of this is in somewhere called Banks Road, Sandbanks. Anybody in here know where Sandbanks is? Yes. What is Sandbanks? Tell me.
Which is
Yes. And this is the main road that runs through the richest bit of Sandbanks, which is, I think, possibly the second most expensive. Sorry? It's, Sandbanks is right, there's Poole Hole, and you've got Bournemouth on one side, and then you get Studden Bay on the other.
Thank you.
And Sandbanks is on the edge. And Roy Hodgson has done TV programmes because he owns a house there, and he's gone to visit all the rich people. Anyway, it turns out from Land Registry that Richard owns this, and he bought it. You can see it there, Richard Grosvenor Plunkett Earl Drax. He bought it, I think, 2009, and he paid £2.5 million for it. So I thought, oh, that's pretty. It's not a large place, but it's a fantastic location because it's right next to the beach, and it's that space, Holwell Pool. Now, if you're thinking of taking your family on holiday this summer, and you want a nice place, sandbags, you can have that for a week for about £7,000 a week, should you feel so inclined, at peak. So, so we're already getting an indication that this is a lot of money. So, what do I do next? Well, this is nerd activity, but one of the things I noticed on their website is they didn't say how much land they actually owned and where it was. So I was struggling a bit with this, and what I did was I talked to Guy Shrubsole. I don't know if anybody knows Guy Shrubsole's work, Lie of the Land. He is the sort of leading figure at the moment who talks about who owns land and, is it fairly distributed. I recommend his book, by the way. Not supposed to do that when we're promoting your own, but really good. I feel he sort of provides a big overview to what I'm doing in a specific way. Anyway, he said to me, go and look at the land deposit. Now, that may sound a bit odd. It's a small corner of any website for councils. What it is that if you own land and you don't want people to put another footpath through it, you have to go to the land deposit and deposit using ordnance survey maps, show where your land is and what properties are on it. So I went and dug these out. There are about 6 of them, and they show which trust and which land is owned. Now, so having got that, and then I then ordered Ordnance Survey a custom map. That's a custom map because it crosses 3 other normal maps. And I got my coloured pencils out. I mapped it all out, and the different colours reflect different trusts of the family. And the blue one is Richard's. So, and then his brother owns them there, and there's 5 of them brothers, and the other members of the family own various other trusts. A trust essentially gives you an income for life, and you have the property for life, but then you hand it on to the next generation. Therefore, not actually have to pay kind of an inheritance tax. You will if you sell your 300,000 flat Hackney or whatever it is. So, anybody like to guess how much land that is? Okay. If I said it's at least 15,000 acres and probably 16, anybody have any idea how many of that might be in square miles? Anybody got that kind of height? Well, it's 23.5 square miles. That's the Dulcet holdings of the Drax family. So I thought they've got a lot of something. So at this point, I went to talk to the editor of the Observer. This is probably around September 2020. He said, we could have Richard Drax. No, he's quite interested because he is clearly a figure that reflects what's going on in the Conservative Party at the moment. He holds all the values that are dominant, and he seems to be very wealthy, and I'm trying to work out exactly how wealthy he is. So the editor said, well, that's an interesting thing to do. I said, no one's written about it. He said, well, okay, we'll keep going and let me know how you get on. So I did. And I then sat down and I looked at the different kinds. I worked out what kind of land, like what was woodland, what was grade 1 farmland, what the going value was. There is also 125 properties that they own on that, ranging from the mansion that you see to small rental cottages and everything in between. 200-year-old houses, mills, lots of different property, a lot of them rented out. Others are provided to members of staff as their accommodation. There is a hut that was resident on there. There's lots of things on there. There's a very big watercress farm as well. So I sat down and tried to work out, and I came up with a valuation of about 150 million. Would be a very conservative figure for what that is worth in terms of land and property. So this is quite significant, and I think I completely underestimated it, by the way. I think that's probably part of its value in retrospect. But anyway, you can see what a nerd I am from that. Now, the other thing that occurred was, I'm just going to whiz through this because I haven't got a lot of time. I want to come to James Drax. So, I also looked through the will because, unfortunately, his father had died in 2017 and his mother in 2019. So he was in the process of inheriting, and something had been inherited by other members of the family. But I also gathered that the family were inheriting something in Swaledale. And so I had to dig around a bit of that because that wasn't referred to anywhere in the public zone. It's not referred to in the Register of Members' Interest, and I couldn't understand why, but I do now understand why. But the family clearly had land in Yorkshire. And it turned out, the only reason I got this was I found an archaeological report. So I look at this archaeological report for this place. This is called Ellerton Abbey, and it's the Ellerton Abbey estate. Ellerton Abbey is a property that was an abbey until Henry VIII came along, and that's the ruins of it. But what I discovered it was a 2,000-acre estate. Now, who owned it? Archaeological report, back of archaeological report, which was online. I looked at the back, and it said, we'd like to thank the Drax family for allowing us access to the estate. So that confirmed that they were the owners of that. So that's another 2,000 acres farm estate. Then the other one, which is a bit nerdy and minor, but I was quite pleased about this, is on it. His father had said, I also need Copperthwaite to my son. And so I looked at the map and I couldn't find Copperthwaite, but I knew it must be somewhere around there because the word Thwaite, Yorkshire Viking word. So I spent quite a long while sort of ticking through, and we're now beginning to enter into the period of COVID, where I was running the university department, but at the same time doing this as a relaxing, spare time activity to keep me sane in the midst of COVID. And Copperthwaite, I just couldn't find. I tried historians, and I spoke to all the local historians. I said, where's Copperthwaite? Copperthwaite? Never heard of it. And I talked to someone in Sweden who'd been an expert on this area and said, where's Copperthwaite? I said, don't know. And then I went to the East Riding Council, and I went to Footpath and said, do you know somewhere called Copperthwaite? No. And eventually, I found myself in a metaphorical dark corner of East Riding called the Commons Register. There was a kind lady in there, and I said, do you know anything about Copperthwaite? She said, oh, I haven't heard of it. She said, but I'll look for you. So about 3 weeks later, she rang me back. She said, I've been into the archives, and I found this piece of paper. And she said, I think this is what you want. And it's dated 1970, and it actually states was purchased by Richard's father in 1970. And what it turns out to be is 500 acres of grouse moor. So the area, and then I was given the location, and it's up on the moor above Ellerton Abbey, and where there are a lot of grouse moors. So I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. So they've got 500 acres of grouse moor as well. So I'm quite getting into this. I'm seeing that, keep finding things out. Let's have a dig a bit more. And then came the point, let's see where we're at. And so about 3 months in, somebody said to me, well, they used to own, till quite recently, did they have plantation or something in Barbados? And I said, no, how do you know that? Oh, somebody told me. So I said, well, who? And they said, well, I can't remember now. So this happened about 2 or 3 times. And then I was reading another excellent book, which I shouldn't be plugging when I've tried Puppy Home. But it's The Sugar Barons by Matthew Parker, which was published about 2010. And in there's a little footnote that says, Drax Hall, every year, water, that's Richard's father, is said to go out to Drax Hall plantation, which the family still own, to make sure it's okay. And sometimes he takes his eldest son, Richard. Oh, I thought, well, that's interesting. So I'd identified that the family had owned Drax Hall. I thought, well, God, that's quite something, because I knew that, so I look up Drax Hall, and I discovered this is like this is like plantation one in the British Empire when it comes to sugar. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So I thought, well, this is sort of interesting. So I thought, I wonder what they've done with it. It's not in the register of men's interests. And so it doesn't seem to own it. He must have sold it, because I thought, this is where I went terribly wrong. I thought, if you were an MP, would you really want to own a plantation in Barbados in which your ancestors had enslaved people to 200 years? I thought, you're not going to want an optic like that. So who have they sold it to? So to get to the bottom of it, I started to think, well, what they would have done is, I can't find it in any form in British Company's house or anywhere else. They probably sold it offshore to somebody. So having some contacts who know a lot about offshore, I said, look, can you find out for me where this is being sold? So for about a month or so, various people beavered about looking in. You know, there were all these leaks in the mid-2010, in, you know, Pandora, what and all that. And people, friends of mine, went through, said, can't find anything. For, I'm really sorry. So at this point, I thought the only way it's going to do it is to look at the registers in Barbados. Unfortunately, the registers in Barbados are not online. So if you can look at anything, you have to go there and look at it. This was COVID, so I couldn't go there and look at it, because that was difficult. And I was then lucky because I encountered another big ex-BBC reporter called Jonathan Smith. And Jonathan lives in Barbados. So I rang him up and I said, look, I've got a problem. I need someone to go to the various offices and see if you find out who owns Drax Hall now. And he's, look, I'm at the game, he said, you know, I've packed up doing investigations. I'm now doing this, and this, really. And then as I talked to him, I said, well, it would take an opportunity to him. And then, being a journalist, his instincts kicked in. He said, all right. So he then was really diligent, and he kept going to these offices in Bridgetown and saying, oh, you know, I'd like to look at this file. And they'd say, well, it's COVID, you can't come in. Or that archive is locked up in another room, or whatever. So he bickered along for a bit, and what happened then was, this, by the way, of Drax Hall, and I will come back to that in a moment, because that's the explanation I need to explain. Anyway, one day, he rang me up with a eureka moment. I mean, he rang me up and he said, I think I've found out. And what he then said to me was, to quote Ian Drury, you could knock me down with a feather, because this is the register of businesses in Barbados. This one is dated February of the year that I was doing this research, 2020. And it says, on here, it's the owner, it says Richard Groner Plunkett Ernley Earl Drax. Occupation, public office holder, UK, MP. So he does own it. And then he'd also, on the same day, got access to the land tax registry. Now this is a map of the plantation, plus the figures in the corner were part of a series of figures they now very helpfully gave us, which indicated how much land tax, because if you're running any land in Barbados, you pay land tax, and you have to do that annually. And they said, oh yeah, he's paid land tax for that, and they showed us a document. So we thought, gosh, so we've got an MP who by then I worked out was the wealthiest landowner in the Parliament, and then owns a plantation in Barbados, as I say, that had a very, very difficult history. So I went back to the editor of the Observer and I said, look, I've made a bit of progress here, you know. What do you think? He said, that's a story. So Jonathan and I wrote it up, and hopefully it's on here. Yeah. So in December 2020, we produced the front page story for both the Observer and the Sunday Mirror. And that's what we had a tour, which means there's a whole lot inside as well, where we explain what the wealth was, the problems with Locadia, the fact that some of the names of the companies didn't add up when you first looked at them, you had to go and dig around. I don't think Richard Drax was very pleased. I sent in advance, because you know we do write a reply, 30 questions about the property and related issues as to things that I didn't understand. He answered 3. One of them was to say that at that point he didn't actually own it because it was in probate, because he was an executor and he was the executor of his parents' will, and therefore the probate hadn't been sealed. Therefore, this was 3 years on from the demise of his father, that he didn't technically own it, although he was the only beneficiary when the probate finished. Now, he told me that he, by email, by the way, because we've never spoken, he told me that the registrar of Men's Interest had said he didn't need to declare until probate was over. Now, my view is that's a really serious misjudgment by the registrar at the time. It seems to me that if you are you're a constituent or member of the public, you should know that. That should be available to you, that process was going ahead. And it just seemed very obvious to me they were significant and in some form should have been alluded to. Eventually he changed it after that story and said he now owns, and you'll find it, owns a business premises in Barbados. So that brings me to talk to you about James Drax, because that's where Hackney fits into my story. So, David O'Shaughnessy was very helpful to me, and he wrote forward to the book. I just happened, that's what he put, and that's very kind of it. But now I'm going to come to James Drax. So, James Drax, 18 years old in 1627. He gets on a boat in London with about 80 other settlers. They sail to Barbados. It takes 5 weeks. And they land in 1627. It's unoccupied because waves of invasion and annihilation had taken place, so there weren't any of the original inhabitants still on the island. The Spanish had left it, Portuguese had left it. So in 1627, the British took claim to Barbados. So all these people unload and they start to work out how they're going to make this work. It was quite typical for second generation to go to the colonies, because the first generation will mind in the house, if you like, the estate and all of that. So James went, and there's a very, very difficult period because they have to start growing their own food. There's no accommodation there. They have to go to accommodation. They got some indentured servants from Britain with them, and they've also got a handful of people that they captured at another ship, the Portuguese ship, which had some enslaved people, and they took them as well. So that's what they start with. James Drax is clearly an impressive character in many ways, because he starts to clear what we know as Drax Hall plantation. He goes into the centre of Barbados rather than where the other plantations initially were, right around the outside. And he starts to clear it. They're trying to work out what to grow. They start growing tobacco, difficult. So they discovered that, tobacco that's been grown in Virginia or elsewhere is of better quality. So that's not really working very well. They grow indigo, but they can do that well, but there's not a huge demand for it. And they're looking for a crop. And one of the other settlers that came with James Drax, called James Holdit, and he tried sugar, but he didn't know a lot about it and it didn't really work out. But this gave, I think, James Drax, and I speculated this, the idea. James Drax probably took him over. Okay, I'm going to get to Hackney, am I? Very quickly. Right, so James Drax actually finds out how to run a sugar plantation. And there's 2 aspects to it. He works out how to integrate plantation so it works over a period of time to do sugar. And that's quite a complicated business. It involves all sorts of things like boiling, sugar, all that. So he makes a fortune. A contemporary biographer said that after a few years, by 1540, James Drax is living like prince. The other person here is his second son. James Drax but to cut a long story short, which is all that by the book, comes back to Britain, and eventually in about 1552, 62, he actually dies. He's about 51, which was unusual at the time. His son then takes over, and that's Henry Drax. Now, this can bring me to a London aspect to it, because those two busts are to be found in what was a church in Gresham Street in the city. This is St Agnes and Anne, which is currently decommissioned but used by the core group of day rate. But it wasn't originally, because where they were was that when Drax came back, he had a lot of money. So that he bought a property, and this is where I'm going to ask for help. He bought a property in the parish of St John Zachary, and that's right next to St Agnes. And what happened was that after he'd been married, the busts were in that church, the whole of that parish was wiped out during the Great Fire of London. So I've been trying to work out where he actually lived. It's a very small number of streets, and I've been looking at the half tax records of that period, which do list streets, but they don't give you numbers in those days, they just have names. And so far I've not located Drax, and I'm working to try and work. I'd like to know which address he lived at. What's interesting is by this time he's also been called James Drax of Hackney, and he has another son who didn't run the plantation. I think this is all explained in the book, but he became, after his father died, he too became Sir James Drax of Hackney. And the puzzle is I'm trying to work out again. That's what the way is. That's the church where those busts are, Agnes and in Gresham Street. And this I'm going to read that because these are sort of the things that I've been trying to work through to see if I can work it out. So I want to know about the Hackney. You see, I'm trying to work out where they lived in Hackney, because what I discovered was the people who had houses in the centre of the city often had a sort of like summer house in Hackney, which sounds a bit ludicrous now, but when you think the Hackney would have been fields, the farms, it takes on a different feel. So I've also been looking at the half tax records, and I've not been able to spot that yet because I can't find the name Drax. I found the Drax who was in Tower Hill, Ursula Drax, but what it quite clearly is the half tax was based on the number of hearths you had. So we're looking for a house. I'm looking for a house that's got they're not going to be one hearth. And obviously the most obvious one that comes up is Brook House, which I'm sure if there's abbey historians of Hackney in here, you will know. And that had 8 hearths, so that's more in line. But the problem is that Brook House, the inhabitants of that in that period, so we're talking the 1550s over the next period, are pretty well known. What is also suggested is that there was a garden which was visited and much appreciated called Drake's Garden, and it suggested that that's where the Drax house properly was. But I haven't been able to locate that. So if there's anybody in this room has any suggestions, I'd be grateful. And I've made quite a lot of effort. I'm just not cracked it yet. And you see, and also what you find is that Drax and Drakes is interchangeable. You find that sometimes it's put down as Drakes. And that's Brook House, who you probably know about, but it became a lunatic asylum. And Peaks was a visitor to Drake's Garden, but unfortunately it doesn't say who owned it at the time. So this is kind of area that you know, which is very near where we are at the moment. I don't think it's here because it's quite clear this would be a sort of kind of place he might be able to afford, but I think it's quite clear who owned this house in that period. So I'm still looking to find out. I did make some progress on his son, Henry Drax, because I looked a will of his wife called Dorothy, and she says our house in Southampton Square. Does anybody know where Southampton Square is? Well, I discovered that what happened was the Southampton built these houses and then sold them to the Bedford family, who, had Bedford Square and owned that big estate there. Well, they then took it and they turned it into Bloomsbury Square. So what you have is that Henry Drax, off the back of great wealth that was accrued, bought a house in the very market even in those days. I also suspect, going back to Henry Drax, that they probably have had their house wiped out during the fire, and that they probably all moved to Hackney in that period while the centre was rebuilt. Because if you can imagine the devastation, the Great Fire of London, it'd be, you'd wait for clearance. It's like any destroyed area. So that's really where I am on that aspect of research, and I'm running over time, so I'm going to stop and go to question and answers.
So, put your hand up if you have a question. Put one here, and then maybe so we'll go here first.
Hi there. Thank you. So it was a James Drax who was the 18-year-old who moved to Barbados. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where was his? Did he have wealth originally? What was his background?
I've had to really truncate the story because we're talking about 10 generations. Essentially, James Drax came from Warwickshire, and he was the second son. Eventually, the first son moves over to Barbados because it's working really well. So he moved in 1827. The complication is that the Drax family and the owners of Charborough House don't actually merge until 1719. And I saved you that old digression. It is in the book. Because I have to deal with the Earl, Ernley, Plunkett, and the Grovers.
Sorry. So he gentry, or is he?
No, they're sort of lone gentry, whilst the owners of Charborough, the Earls, are proper landed gentry, but not aristocrats.
Okay. Maybe here.
So what's going to happen to Richard Drax then? I mean, can he be brought before the Orbs or something because he's not paid his dues?
Well, he's done nothing illegal. You'll notice that I've not said anything personal because I don't think my job's to deal with the facts. I'm, journalist. What I can tell you is that I've just been in Barbados. I often work when I can. I've done it here and I've done it there. I often work as a sort of collaboration, double-handed act with the poet laureate of Barbados, who is a woman called Hester Phillips, and she has moved into writing about this. She now feels that her poetry, because she feels so strongly about all this, should be about her. She's the voice of her ancestors. She was brought up next to Drax Hall, not in wealth, and she used to go on to Drax Hall, and she now has a real feeling about their ancestors' voice. It was really hard for me to put the ancestors' voice here because enslaved people, weren't in a position to leave their records, and you don't really get many, and they're mostly on the American enslaved people, and then wrote up there towards abolition. So it's quite. But she, when we work together, she delivers her poems. Her poems are very powerful, and she talks about what it'd be like, for instance, to be the mother of a boy that because chattel slavery, which James Drax is said to be the person who invented chattel slavery, which is of course what the UN General Assembly about 3 or 4 weeks ago has described and voted on, and a majority said it's the greatest crime in humanity. Was chattel slavery and how it worked over these hundreds of years. So he was the person who worked out that, you know, you could hold slaves in perpetuity, so you inherited their children as well. And Esther talks about that and says how you have to brutalize your own child so they're prepared for what they're going to get. That, and I mean, when I was in Barbados, I gave a lecture like this at the museum, and it was a very emotional event because I think people are more and more thinking about that than those aspects of their life. What it must be like to have, you know, that for your ancestors for hundreds of years were probably subject to the brutality is quite a hard thing to process. And Esther works really well with that because she deals with the emotional side, which I tried also to deal with the fact that, you know, I don't know that my family has ever had anything to do with slavery, but I am English in part, and therefore I have benefited from enslavement in a way. And so I have a legacy of enslavement. And I think it's important to listen to people who have got a legacy of slavery, because there's a big movement here to knock back all the arguments about apologies and reparations. But it's not empathetic, because I think that what you have to listen to is why people want an apology. What's it about? What does it mean? Because I was taught, and my generation, I was born in 54, I was taught that we abolished the slave trade. We abolished slavery. We have the West Africa brave sailors who went out, which is true, but, you know, the numbers considering that the English alone brought in, well, the British brought in literally 3 million people into the West Indies alone. The scale of it is very big. So I think that there's, you know, it's a big issue. Esther deals with it better than I do. I try to provide some facts. Esther says there is and I sometimes work with other people who are very concerned about reparations, who do have. I work with someone called Daniel sometimes, who's from Guyana. So that's what I try to deal with.
Got another question over here.
Sorry, it's a long answer, but I think it's quite a big area to cover.
I just wondered if you knew any more about Drax Hall. For instance, how many slaves there were?
Well, it varies at various times, and you could track them down through the registers at various points. One of the problems I did have is that I wrote, there are archives still. It's quite complicated, but there are certainly still archives in Charborough House, and the family have them. They won't give access. They say they will give access in respectable academics, but I haven't yet found someone who's actually had that access. And I asked, I mean, you'd be stunned. I wrote to Richard Drax when I wrote to him, and I have to say, after the Observer articles and so forth, I didn't think I was his most popular person, but I wrote to him and said, you know, dear Richard Drax, you'll recognise that I'm the person who write in the Observer articles, but I would like to see the archives, and I, you know, would like to see what's there so I can do a history of your family. I didn't get a reply.
Okay, we've got another question here at the back. It's also lay it from you.
Okay.
So,
Can I ask, I used to work at UCL, and there I believe there are the records that were paid on when the law was changed about slavery in this country.
Yeah.
An awful lot of slave owners were compensated vast amounts of money. And the records are in UCL, I believe.
Well, I can tell you.
Were you able to look at them?
I don't need to because it's all online. And I can tell you that John Wainley Sawbridge Earl Drax received, on behalf of his wife, who was the bloodline, £4,292 for compensation for releasing 189 enslaved people. And one of the ideas is where what he did with the money was he built that wall I showed you right at the beginning. But I don't know. There's huge debates about what happened to that money and whether it was an engine for the Industrial Revolution and the railways and canals and all that huge area. Does that answer your question?
Oh. So very yes. So thank you very much. As we were talking about money, I was thinking of the Bank of England and when they did their sort of exhibition around Bank
Well, speaking.
Sorry, Bank of England, and wanting, for us to understand their role in slavery. They had some people that had loans from them that they defaulted on, and I was thinking whether or not they've been able to help you in a sense of to follow the money sort of thing, if there was any loans given to the Drax family or any arrangements that would sort of help with the trail of what they owned or they
I
owned.
haven't dealt with the Bank of England. I spent more time talking to the Church of England because Church of England has recognised this issue, not least of all because they did own plantations and have enslaved people, usually through the Society of Protection of the Propagation of the Gospel. But nonetheless, it's a big issue, and they have been. They have said they want to pay reparations to the tune of about £100 million over a 10-year period. This is being blocked at the moment. I understand the Charity Commission isn't happy with it, and there's some politics involved, and it's been delayed certainly for 18 months, and the outcome is not yet clear. There is also the campaign led by Professor Nigel Biggar. He wrote a book called Reparations recently, and he is a hardline anti-reparations person. He argues that all the arguments, it goes back to all the same, it goes almost back to the things I remember at school, which is that we abolished slavery in its forms, and it's all a long time ago, and it didn't drive the Industrial Revolution. It's all those arguments, which I thought we'd got past because it's, there's a lot of work has gone on. And anyway, that reparations, Nigel Biggar is an emeritus professor at Oxford of Theology and Ethics, has got a group of people who think like him, who are eminent, to try and stop that. So that's sort of where we are. Just not your question, because I don't have it back in English.
Okay, we have a question here at the back.
Thanks. In terms of the land out in Barbados and Drax Hall, do you know what it's used for still today? Is it still a plantation?
And or it not 3 weeks ago. They placed mortgages on the still cropping sugar, but it's not the valuable substance it once was, and it's often subsidised by the government. They get about 700 tonnes a year from it, but there's moves afoot to see that essentially Mia Mottley, who is Prime Minister of Barbados, who is a barrister, who's I find really impressive, as I think she's going to be on world stage before going on. She's very good at climate and lots of other things. She's had a meeting with Richard Drax, which didn't go too well in Barbados. But basically, she said, I think you should hand over Drax Hall to the people of Barbados so it can it's some kind of reparation for what your family did here. So Hilary Beckles, who is a major figure, in the first article was described Drax Hall as a crime scene, a killing zone, because so many people who were enslaved or kept servants in indentured died in brutal circumstances there in those 200 years. And so it was there, Drax Hall is there, it showed you a picture of it. It's worth noting that it's actually a very historical though, because it is the oldest residential home in the areas. So it's actually a great story, but it has a very contrasting history about it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Just on the last point you made, I think there's a place in Cuba, Santiago de Cuba, which was the home of one of the Spanish or Portuguese.
There is an argument that there's somewhere else has popped up recently.
Yeah, there's 50 and 55. I was there, and it's probably 100 years before.
Well, I haven't actually done the legwork check, but you may be right that there are 3 Jacobean mansions, 2 on Barbados and 1 in South Carolina, and it may be, in terms of actual build properties, that the one in Cuba. It would make sense in a way because Cuba precedes. And
my question though was to do with was it James who was he originated chapters?
yeah, Sir James, yeah.
Lots of people involved in this business weren't shy about recording what they were doing. Did he leave records?
I then lost these, and the most disturbing thing I looked at was the diaries of Thomas Whistle,
Yeah.
which I would say is not for the weak of stomach, it's just a boy. He was no seer, and what he did to his enslaved men and women is just unspeakable. You know, I don't know quite what happened on Drax Hall in that period, but there's no indication that it was better or worse than all the other plantations. The one thing I do mention in the book is that during the 1816 Muscat rebellion, and whilst there was a report afterwards, and it doesn't name Drax Hall, but it points out at the end what reparations were given to the owners of plantations that were damaged during the rebellion, and Drax Hall is number 10 as a big sum of money. So it was obviously wrecked during the rebellion. So that does indicate that there was no goodwill towards searchers. Are we done?
Got one more question here.
It isn't a question, really. I just curious, the legacies of British slavery, that big project ground of UCL, has that been of use to you?
Enormously.
Sorry?
Enormously.
Enormous.
Really, really useful.
Yeah, in case I mean, I'm sure most people here know about it, but it is a fantastic website.
There's also one about the shipment movement.
Yeah.
And one of the things I sort of eventually was able to work out with the help of that was that James Drax wasn't just a slave plantation owner. He also he did ships to bring in enslaved people from Africa to Barbados. So I've been able to get further with that. There's only a couple of examples, but I think he indicated that he was doing more, but he tended to work a bit off the books, so it's quite hard to track more.
The two things, can I? Just two slow things. On the shoe, I wasn't very clear in my first question.
Sorry, people won't be able to hear you.
Damn it. I wasn't very clear with my first question, which was really about he didn't declare how much he was worth, did he? That's what I meant by couldn't he be?
No, I think there's a sort of legal point or parliamentary point, and there's what you might say you should do. And I would say that he met the criteria of the registrar who sets the rules under the Standards Committee in Parliament. I think it's really weak. I've got big issues. I've had big issues about other things as well. And secondly, it struck me that if I knew I was going to own a plantation in Barbados, even if it wasn't already major business in another country, I'm in the process of probate, I would have said, I'm in the process of probate, I'm about to own a significant thing. Now, that's my personal view. It clearly wasn't the same one. Richard Drax did not have the same view.
Okay, really interesting talk and very good question and answers. If you can talk to me.